Yes, hello everyone. Welcome to the first video of the third section of the fundamental course. So what we're going to be looking at right now is a federal funds rate. The federal funds rate refers to the interest rate that banks charge other banks for lending them excess cash from their reserve balances on an overnight basis. So if you refer back to one of the lessons that I taught about the monetary policies, if you remember, there were three types. There was the purchases of bonds, there was the setting of interest rates and the discount rate, and also establishing reserve requirements. Now, that's where the reserve requirements come into play. The government actually requires certain banks and pretty much all banks even to have a certain amount of capital or cash in hand with them. And every bank has to uphold this requirement. So what that means is at times they would have to borrow from other banks who have a lot more in reserve. Therefore, of course, with any transaction that occurs in the economic sort of industry, you're always gonna have a bit of interest rate on every single transaction. And that's exactly what we look for here. This is the federal funds rate. So to not cause confusion, there's a difference between the Fed funds rate and the interest rates. The interest rates are the rate at which it costs banks to borrow, as set by the Fed. However, what differentiates the Fed funds rate and the interest rates is the Fed funds rate is a range that the banks can lend and borrow to each other in terms of a rate that they have to legally own, as a reserve. Short-term interest rates are very sensitive to these changes. So that means consumer loans, credit loans, and the stock market um, are heavily affected by these Fed funds rate. FOMC, if you don't know what that is, it's where, the Fed actually meets to discuss uh, the economy and what's going on, to see what they can do about their monetary policies, about fiscal policies. They meet 8 times a year to determine the Fed funds rate, influenced by the core inflation rate and durable goods order report. These are the 2 points that we're going to be looking at in terms of our Fed funds rate indicators. But I hope I've made it clear what the difference actually is. So the Fed funds rate is the range that banks can lend to each other. So it could be, let's just say, between 0.5% and 1%, whereas the interest rate is the rate at which it costs banks to borrow as set by the Fed. So some important info to know. The Fed funds rate is a suggestion for the banks for a range of interest rates the lender bank can charge the borrowing bank. If you remember correctly, banks will borrow and lend from each other to uphold the appropriate amount of reserve requirements. The two banks negotiate an appropriate rate. Obviously, this is between them. And the average rate across the board in all the banks is called the effective federal funds rate. Essentially, the Fed funds rate is all about the rate range of lending between the banks. And is the Fed involved in this? They can be if a bank requires funds from the Fed themselves. So let's just say, for example, rather than one bank actually going to the other banks and looking to borrow, that bank is going to go to the Fed themselves. So the Fed is, the central bank. They're the people right at the top. And then you've got the more private banks that are obviously lower than them. And the Fed sets a discount rate, it's called, which is the interest rate that the Fed charges banks to borrow from them directly. This is usually higher as they want to encourage transactions between the banks directly. So just to explain that a bit further, what the Fed actually want is a free-flowing market. They want each bank to trade with each other by borrowing and lending, of course. So the whole reason why the Fed actually charges usually a higher rate than what other banks would charge between themselves is so um, you know, they encourage people to have more transactions between themselves. And I don't mean people, of course, I mean the banks. They encourage more of the banks to trade between themselves, borrow and lend. Anyways, guys, we're going to be looking at this in more detail when we start looking at the indicators that they actually look at to determine the Fed funds rate.